last week, around age 9, gradually we start to separate out. And we have gradually we separate out, and ourselves, we start to separate out of the world. And remember, we talked about the way that gradually over those first, turning 3 and 4, 5, 6, gradually, and around the age 9 is when we separate out. And we become out of this. Now, so humanity also gradually separated out. In different places, different times, in different ways. So all the different local stories are about how different peoples separated out in different ways at different times. Now remember, we talked about in main lesson terms, in terms of the main lesson journey, we talked about the fairy tale as capturing this, the fairy tale captures this magical time. And this is just a drawing from one of Grimm's fairy tales, the flying boat. But it just gives you this sense of the magical world of fairy tales. And the fairy tale world that we tell in class 1, really, in one sense, I often think about it as it's like our indigenous stage. It's the embedded stage. It's when we're still back here. And fairy tales capture this. I gave the examples. But the fairy tale world, the child is living in this, everything talks to each other. The farmer went into the forest, and there he met the fox. And the fox said, if you cut down this tree, you'll find a golden goose. So the farmer took his axe, cut down the tree, and there he found a golden goose. And he took the golden goose home, put it in the hen house, and the next morning, there they found a golden egg. The fox talks to the farmer, the golden egg. It's all one. It's all part of this beautiful world. So the fairy tales really represent this beautiful, united, unified world of, in a sense, our first way of thinking. It's the beginning of the journey. And our class 1 and 2 main lessons are really enabling the child to live into this time. And that's why it's so important, we think, for the child to hear these fairy tales, so that at this first stage, when they are still embedded in the world, they're experiencing the world through stories that, in a sense, echo it back to them. They hear it back to them. They experience the world as one. Everything talks to each other. The animals talk to each other, flowers, the sun, the moon, everyone is united. But then gradually we step out, and gradually we start to separate. And gradually we start to think of ourselves as separate from the world there. As I mentioned to you, at a certain point in class 2, you'll always find, if you tell a story about animals speaking to people, some child will say, animals can't talk. What do you mean? Animals, they can't talk to people. And it tells you they've already made that change. They've separated out. It doesn't make sense anymore. They don't think like that anymore. They've moved on. Now this happened, so it happens in the young child, and it happened in humanity. We started to separate out. Now, we mark this change through all the things that we do in class 3, in the main lessons. But we also now start to tell particular kinds of stories. And we start to tell particular creation stories that really capture this sense of becoming separate. And as you know, in class 3, we start with some of the great Hebrew stories, the creation stories. But I talked last week, most importantly, about the way that those stories that we tell in class 3, the key element, I don't have the slide in the deck, unfortunately, the key element is the emergence now, in a sense, separating out from this beautiful world. And as we talked about, the unique thing about those stories we tell in class 3 is the Garden of Eden story. And how in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve were so beautifully looked after, everything was provided for them. If they wanted to eat, they just reached the tree. If they wanted to have shelter, they slept and they were covered over. Beautiful world, and then something goes wrong and they have to leave. And this is this experience of separating. So we tell those stories in class 3 for a very particular reason, because it has so perfectly this picture of separating out. So the Garden of Eden story, we call the expulsion from paradise, captures beautifully this separation, this leaving this beautiful united world. And this is really the world that Indigenous people around the world, First Nations, are going through themselves. They're being extracted out of that. It's what I've seen with the Orangasli. They've been taken out of this beautiful united world and they're now into this separate world where we have to, in a sense, work differently. And now our journey takes us through different cultures and different places on the earth, and we pick up now the thread, the golden thread, of how we tell this story. As you know, in class 4 we do the Norse myths, and we take them through this another creation world. But it's really only in class 5 where we start the kind of world story of the different cultures and how they have emerged. Now there's one slide, some slides I don't have, and which this has been put together from different places. But we really start now the story of the great civilizations on Earth. And the great civilizations, the great epochs, are all different ways of stepping out of this original First Nations Indigenous consciousness of embeddedness. And all the great epochs, the great civilizations, they all start, the first one I always like to start with is China, because it's the ongoing sort of grand sort of story of the great first civilization. Then comes India, and that's why we start in class 5. We should start with, and obviously you'll run here your local Chinese origin stories, we'll have the Malay stories as well. But then we start on this grand narrative of India. And India, and in its and the great incarnations of the different gods. Here is this is Krishna, one of the incarnations of Vishnu, and so we bring this original stories of Indian civilization. Now, of course, this civilization is still going strong, very very rich and very powerful. And we have a look at the extraordinary cultural things that we can still see manifest in this culture: the dance, sculpture, the great enormous palaces and so on. And so India represents a core element at the foundation of so many cultures. If they map all of European languages, you map all they can do these language maps where you map all the different languages and where they come from. And it's like a tree. And like all the different branches are like all the tree. And then if you go down, the branches come together into a trunk. And then the trunk goes down into a root. And at the root of that is Sanskrit. Sanskrit is like the core language. It's spread out into all the other, certainly all the European languages that came out. And so India in many ways is a kind of a source. China on the other side is another source, very huge, massive culture. And now we're going to track the different cultures that emerged from there in different ways. And there's a thread, this golden thread. And so the first one we look at is India, and then the next we move is to the Middle East. And in the Middle East, we look at the stories of ancient Persia, Iran, and the great Middle Eastern cultures, the Tigris and Euphrates. So we know that so many things emerged out of there. And these were things that were echoing on right across between China and India and the Middle East. So the development of writing, it all happens around similar times. And in the Middle East we have left behind these remarkable ways of experiencing their religion. They have the religion of Zoroaster, worshipping of the sun. In contrast to India, the ancient Persian religion has basically almost vanished from the face of the earth. From a whole civilization, there's now a tiny group of Persian people in India who keep their religion alive. Tiny, tiny group, 100,000 people or less, called the Parsis in some part of India, compared to the Indian civilization itself. But they left behind these remarkable, extraordinary sculptures and imagery of their view of the world, this very powerful representation of their gods and their kings in the ancient Persian culture. Now then, of course, the next great civilization that emerges is, of course, ancient Egypt. Again, moving westward. And it's in this civilization that, of course, it has fascinated everyone ever since. Had a great rise and then a fall. And so what's left behind now is simply these monuments. But we now know behind it was the extraordinary development of science and the technology that could actually build this. You know, we're amazed by this technology, we can do this, but then have a look at that technology that could do that. How extraordinary that was, to leave behind these massive monuments. And the extraordinary artwork, the development of this incredibly sophisticated writing method that went through over thousands of years, and also the philosophy behind it. Now, gradually, these are steps on the way of individualizing, but they're still within a particular worldview. They're still within what I call the older worldview, the more original, instead of where everything on earth is living out the work of the gods, or God. You know, we talked about the Australian Aborigines. Originally, their life was really a living out of the dreaming. The ancestors created the world, and we now live out what they created. Even our marriage system was given to us by the ancestors. And if you go through each of these ancient cultures, they each have this sense that we are living out what the gods have laid down. So in ancient Egypt, this is the famous weighing of the heart. And the Egyptians were absolutely concerned about what happened after we die. And they believed that you went on a journey to the underworld on a boat, but they weighed your heart. And your heart determined what would happen to you after death. But this was again all laid down by the gods. Everything was laid down by the gods. Now, all of these original cultures, whether it's China, India, Egypt, all live out this grand picture of the grand picture of human life living out the work of the gods. They're, in a sense, living out a mythology. You could say they're living out a mythology. And each of those cultures had developed a very impressive technology. They've each developed paper. They've each developed the ability to build massive monuments, as we see in the great temples, Great Wall of China. All of these have massive technology. But now something new happens, and there's some new step, and something happened that led on to our way of the world we have today. And when we look back at that, big question is, where did all this start? Where did all this technology come from? Now, one of the big questions is, why didn't the technology, this modern, happen in China or in India? Why did it happen where it did happen, which was in the West? This is one of the big questions that historians consider, because all of them had, each of those had all the foundational technology to make that next step. It's one of the big questions. It's debate. People wrote PhDs on this. It's a big debated question. Why did it happen in the West? And so what I'm going to tell the story now is how it did happen in the West, and then how it's become now a world consciousness. As I said, everything has to start somewhere. It happened in one place, but now it becomes part of the world. And what made the big difference, what seems to be a turning point, is something that was given a historical, mythological picture. And that is the story of the Trojan War. It seems to be a turning point in this journey, because something new emerges. Now, you can get elements of this in other cultures, in other civilizations, but something really big happened that led to all the things that came later on. And this is the famous story of the war between the Greeks and the Trojans, who were on the other side of the Aegean Sea. And as you know the story, Helen of Troy, so beautiful, Paris falls in love with her, takes her away, and then her husband Menelaus gets his brother Agamemnon, and the Greeks come, and there is this war for 10 years. And it can't be resolved. For 10 years they're fighting around Troy. And there's no way of actually resolving it. Until at last, one clever man has an idea. As you all know, the story of Odysseus, those of you who have done maybe class 5. So Odysseus, one of the Greek generals, has this idea. And it's a trick. They're going to trick the Trojans. And as you know the story, they decide that they're going to make a horse, this massive horse, made of wood, that they will leave on where all their tents were. The Greeks are going to pretend to go away. Inside the horse are 50 of their best fighters, and they're going to let the Trojans think that it's a gift from the gods. So sure enough, they do it. Odysseus and his men hide inside. The Greeks go away. The Trojans come out, and they see this horse, and they think, we have won. And this is a gift from the gods. So we're going to praise our gods. They drag the horse in, as they do. The horse comes in, and of course they have a great celebration. They all too much to imbibe, and of course, as they all go to sleep that night, secretly Odysseus and his men come out of the horse. They come and they overwhelm the city. They open the gates. The Greeks come back, and they defeat the Trojans. They win the war. Now, and of course, how did Odysseus do it? It was a clever trick. He used his head. It was reason. He worked out, it was a trick, unfortunately. He tricked them. But they were in the battle to the death. And this, they say, is the beginnings of Greek culture, which leads into all the extraordinary things of ancient Greece. These beautiful, exquisite sculptures, which they still don't know how they could get such balance in marble, like one single man sculpting this extraordinary thing. It's perfectly balanced so it doesn't fall over. And he's got all the elements of the athletic, the discus thrower. And this leads into the extraordinary culture that is ancient Greece, all dedicated to their gods. But most importantly, something new starts to come into human thinking, because they start to think in a new way. They start to look at the world differently. Now, whereas before, all the way from indigenous First Nations, all the way through to the Egyptians, They looked at nature as being the work of divinity, the gods, in some way or other. So, for example, if a thunderstorm came, the older Greek would say, the thunderstorm, it's caused by Zeus, the god of thunder. Zeus is riding in the cloud, and if the lightning strikes, it's Zeus throwing down his lightning bolt on the earth. That's what's causing the thunder. If I was a Norseman, if I was a Viking, right, another First Nations people, who would I have said that the thunderstorm was? Thor, exactly right. They said that was Thor hurling his thunderbolt. Aboriginal people, they have a